Hello and welcome to Liberty Church Manzini's Bible Reading Plan Devotional. Right now we are reading Matthew chapter 1 and I'm excited to share with you some of the things that I picked up that God spoke to me as I was reading through this chapter. So let's look at the beginning there from verse 1 to verse 16. If you're like me, it's very possible that as you read through these specific verses, you may have done what a lot of us do on social media, right? We just go through the timeline, look at things, browse through quickly, like, love, comment, and we just do our little snippets of these moments, so to speak. And as we look at these verses, verse 1 to 16, they say things like so-and-so is the father of so-and-so and the father of so-and-so. And it's easy to just be like, oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah. And then we move on. But if we do that, we can miss something pretty incredible that's happening in these verses. Because you see in verse 22, it tells us that all of this that we're reading happened to fulfill a promise that God made through his prophet hundreds of years ago. So God had made a promise a very long time ago, and we see it being fulfilled as we're reading these verses. Verse 1, for example, says, Abraham was the father of Isaac. Again, you might be like, Abraham was the father of Isaac, maybe like, maybe love, maybe comment, and then move on. But no, pause, slow down and look at this. If you step back and you go to Genesis, from chapter 12 in Genesis all the way to chapter 21, you will find out that from that little line, Abraham was the father of Isaac, Abraham and his wife Sarah followed God to an unknown place. They received a promise from God that they would have a son. And then they went through these seasons of waiting and trusting and making mistakes. And then eventually this son was born. And hundreds of years later, this continues. And God had said something to them. He said, I will bless all the nations of the world through you. And now in Matthew chapter 1, we begin to see that fulfilled. If we slow down, we see something amazing happening here. So what's the lesson for us here? What I learned is three things. The first is that God makes promises. God makes promises. And the second is that God keeps all his promises. He made this promise and many others in these verses that we might scroll through, and we see him keep every single promise that he has made. And the last thing is that God's promises take longer than we think they should to be fulfilled. So what should we do? What do we do about that? God makes promises. That's great. So what's my part? God makes promises, and so I should remember the promises that he has made to me. Let's remember the promises that God has made to us. The same way that God spoke to Abraham and promised him something, God has spoken to each one of us. And if you're listening to this and you think, Zinty, God hasn't spoken to me, he hasn't promised me anything, open your Bible. Maybe go to Psalm 139. Maybe go to Psalm 100. Maybe go to any of the chapters in the Bible, and you will begin to see the promises that God has made to us as his people. And God speaks these general promises and some specific things that he has for each one of us. So let's remember the promises that God has made to us. Not only should we remember, but remember we say God makes promises. He also keeps his promises. He makes them and he keeps them. We don't have to try to make them happen on our own. We don't have to strive. We don't have to keep reminding him like he's forgotten. We must remember what he has said, but we should also know that he has not forgotten and he's able to keep his promises. So even as we remember his promises, we should rest. We should rest in the fact that God keeps his promises. God had spoken many years ago to Abraham, and he said, I will give you a son, and the whole world will be blessed through him. And hundreds of years later, God keeps that promise in Matthew chapter 1 as Jesus Christ is born. And today we are all blessed through him. So let's remember, God has promised us so much. Let's rest. God keeps his promises. But also, like we say, these promises take a long time. Longer than we think. Longer than we expect. Longer than maybe is comfortable for us. So what do we do about that? We must remain. We must remain in him, even as we wait for the promises to be fulfilled. You know, God has made specific promises to me. God has made promises to Lou and I about the calling that he has for our lives, about some personal things. God has made promises, I'm sure, to you. And maybe he made those promises when you got saved some 20 years ago. Maybe he made those promises when your child was first born some 30 years ago. And you've been waiting for those promises to be fulfilled. My encouragement to each one of us is let's remain in him as we wait for him to fulfill those promises. Because hundreds of years later, Jesus was born. And the promise that was made to Abraham was fulfilled. Because God makes promises. God keeps every single one of his promises. And we must remember that even though it takes longer than we think, we can remain in him as we wait for those promises. So my question for you today, or my encouragement for you today, is as you read through Matthew chapter 1 and as we continue to read through the book of Matthew, let's slow down and let's see what God is saying. Let's slow down and let's hear what God is saying. And let's remember that he is a promise maker, he's a promise keeper, and no matter how long it takes, the promise will be fulfilled. Have an incredible week. Have an incredible day, and let's continue to remain in the promise keeper.